welcome back to another episode of Data Protection Gumbo. And obviously, you know me, I'm Demetrius Malbro, your host. And today I have Sam Curry on, who is the VP and CISO over at ZScaler. So, Sam, welcome back to Data Protection Gumbo. You have been on a couple times, so really interested in tapping in and seeing exactly what's on your mind right now that we all need to be aware of.
It's
How
always
are
good to
you?
be here. It's good to be here, Demetrius, and I'm doing well, man. And thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And that there's never enough news and headlines that actually come across. And I know one big one is the Baltimore bridge collapse,
My
and
goodness, that thing was
and
awful.
maybe that's not cyber related, but I heard some sprinklings. I don't want to spread FUD, but that one's a big one that went on with the infrastructure of the U.S. Critical infrastructure, and I also saw some draft rules that came over as well around reporting
Hmm.
a substantial cyber attack within, I think it's 4 days or 72 hours, no, 3 days,
There's,
72
there's actually
hours.
there's actually two things that happened there. But yeah, I'm
Okay,
sorry, I didn't
yeah.
mean to interrupt you. Yeah,
Enlighten us. No, go ahead. This
yeah.
is
So
your
so
podcast.
so it's your podcast. I'm here. I'm here at your pleasure. The first was last year. The SEC came out with a 4-day requirement at the beginning of the year, and it had to do with materiality.
Right.
And so that's been a big subject of conversation, and distinguish that from what happened at the end of the year in 2023 with Tim Brown and Solar Winds in the SEC, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because those are two very distinct things. One was, so how and when do you need to disclose, and that went into effect, of course, much more recently. But the other one was a look back at, especially around the IPO and around the incident that they had, and looking at the conduct, and it was quite controversial, the
Yeah.
conduct of the company and officers of the company, although it singled out Tim. And of course, there has been an amicus brief filed now by a number
Mm-hmm.
of folks. Now, contrast
You
that
said
with what happened.
amicus?
Amicus meaning friend in Latin. An amicus brief is basically uninterested parties file a friend of the court brief. And so it's 30 organizations, CISOs and former CISOs have basically come out and said, this is not a good thing. And while perhaps the prosecutors for the SEC, in my non-lawyer perspective, went a little too far in prosecution, this perhaps goes a little too far the other way, and somewhere in the middle is where the jurisprudence is going to come out. We're all going, where is it
Okay.
going to land? And and we're all interested because it has a big impact on how we determine materiality, how we talk to boards, and what we say, because the accusations leveled against Tim and against the company have big implications for what we say and when we say it. And there's fears like, if we went public with what's happening in some cases and those things aren't fixed, it could lead to more risk. Shareholders do have a right to know, especially they have a right to know things that are material in a timely manner. And who determines materiality? Because most cyber professionals are not officers of the company in an SEC sense. How does that dialogue happen? And so this is all new ground. It's not that materiality didn't have to be disclosed before. It's just that it's highly volatile now as our profession begins to develop standards and norms that are really crystal clear in other ones. And then in 2024, we had a presidential directive in mid-March to come
Mm-hmm.
up with a reporting standard for critical infrastructure. And actually, I think it may be a bit soon, but the bridge
Yeah.
might be a good analogy for a lot of what is very, very vulnerable, and certainly lives are at stake with critical
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure in a digital sense. We've seen that now. But on March 27th, CISA came out with new guidance.
Yeah.
Actually, let's be clear. It came out with a 47-page
Yeah.
document.
457 or
It's
something.
a
It was
large
a lot.
number, almost
Right.
half a thousand, and 60-day comment period on that. One of the
Yep.
criticisms was that in order to disclose, critical infrastructure providers have got maybe dozens of different regulations they have to consider and figure out. So how do we navigate this and what do we do? And so this is supposed to be the one regulation to rule them all, I suppose, right? So it has two specifications. The first is you have to disclose an incident on a critical infrastructure provider, public or private sector, within 72 hours. So
Right.
that's where the 3 days comes from. And the second part is disclose payment of a ransom within 24.
Right.
So, those may be, people may be confused about that, but Actually paying a ransom implies that you moved money, you know what's going on. 24 hours isn't unreasonable. The harder part is actually the 72 hours. And it's kind of alluded to. And of course, as we record this, it's March 29th, right? So unless somebody's
Mm-hmm.
a really fast reader, and most people haven't yet gone through it yet, let alone commented, it's 72 hours is difficult. Some incidents like ransom, it's easy to know. Your computer's locked and you've got a ransom note and you know something's going on. Although in the case of encryptionless ransomware, it's different. But like, you have an incident. There's no doubt. Now you're deciding consequences. You should be able to understand it, convene. You really should have a plan in place, especially critical infrastructure. A plan in place for how to communicate, how to make decisions. 72 hours is actually pretty reasonable. Now, it's the more advanced attacks that's more difficult.
Okay.
Sometimes it's hard to know, did you have an incident because they cover up their tracks? They were maybe on one system out of thousands. Did they
Mm-hmm.
get something? Was it encrypted or not? Is this a breach or isn't it? And I think what people need to realize is that disclosure of an incident and working with the government is not the same thing as pasting it on the cover of the New York Times. Is not the same thing. And it's really, really important to sit with cross-functionally with people like your CFO and your legal counsel, and make sure you understand the liability and trade-offs between disclosure and non-disclosure, because I don't think they are what most people think they are. And this is a deeper
Yeah.
subject, right? And you've got to game this out as a whole of company thing. It's not just,
Right.
and when I say game it out, I mean practice. And
Yeah.
a lot of
And you
yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
and I posted on LinkedIn yesterday. I created a little diagram which had 96 hours, which the SEC
Hmm.
disclosure for materiality,
That's right.
and then I had 72 hours for the new draft rule around substantial attacks, reporting substantial attacks. And then I had on there 24 hours to report a ransom payment as well, because there's maybe some confusion around all the different disclosure reports and when do you have to actually report to the SEC and also to the government as a whole, right? Or CISA to be exact as well. So just wanted to try to clear that up as well. And then you mentioned encryptionless
Yeah,
ransomware. So my mindset is saying that that's more of a like an extortion or exfiltration or double
that's exactly
extortion when they post it on the website. Is that what you're speaking in relevance to?
it. Yeah, that's exactly it. Now your map is really important, but no substitute for the lawyer. And I would almost point lawyer to your work, because
Hmm.
it's not the same for all constituents. Now, ultimately, over time, that's all going to converge, or people will copy it for other. It will all start to harmonize, is my prediction. But yeah, on the case of encryptionless ransomware, you mentioned double extortion. So it's sort of like we had the first kind of extortion, everything's encrypted, and then we got the second kind of extortion. The double part was,
Sam, you
holding you
still
over a
there?
barrel and saying we're going to go public with this data. Conti used to do this, for instance, quite aggressively. And then some bright person on the dark side said, wait, why are we going to all this trouble of actually encrypting stuff? Let's just do that second part. And so, yeah, so the idea here is, if you take the data and then you basically don't have the operational costs of encrypting everything, then not only are your costs lower, you can ask for a little bit less money and have a higher chance of them paying you and avoid the embarrassment. So basically, I would point lawyers at your site and say, hey, let's go through and make sure what applies to us when. And I would monitor it in an ongoing fashion. But your other comment about encryptionless ransomware and double extortion, spot
Hmm.
on. So the way double extortion emerged was, the first kind of extortion was we encrypted all your stuff. And if you want to go back to business, you got to unencrypt it. That's pretty rough. But then
Right.
the double part came in with, and it's sort of like doubling down. It says, if you don't pay us, we're also going to take all that data and expose it. In theory, that provides you with more incentive, because it's going to be more embarrassing, more fines, your customers will hate you, etc. And then some smart person on the dark side said, wait a minute, what if we just do that second part? We're in a world where we're asking for a lot of money, but because we have a lot of cost, it's actually difficult operationally to go through and encrypt everything. It's got to be simultaneous. You got to get everything, because
Yeah.
if you don't, from the bad guy's perspective, then your victim is still going to continue operating. So So let's use this example.
Yeah, sure.
If you have, let's say you ask for 20 million bucks, I'm just random numbers, but you got like a 5% chance of payment, then on average you're going to get $1 million over time, right, per victim. But in
Hmm.
the case of, but you've got high costs. So now you look at just doing the second part, we're going to out your data. We're not going to encrypt anything. You can still continue operating. So now the first incentive here is for them to pay, that they're still able to continue making money,
Right.
right? The victim. And you think, oh, what does that mean? It means that you're not, there's a little pressure removed, but they're able to still continue to generate cash, right?
Right.
And now let's say you don't ask for 10. Let's say you ask for 20 million, you ask for 5 million. But now let's say what if your percentage of chance of paying goes up to 50%? So not only do you have lower costs, now you're getting 2.5 million per victim. That's just better business, right? The area under the margin curve is higher. And so it's not to say that it's always like that, but so what we're seeing is an increase in encryptionless ransomware attacks, or ransom. It's not even ransomware attacks, it's ransom attacks, because it's
Yeah.
not,
Okay.
right?
Hmm.
So you go through and you're quicker. You can hit more victims with the same resources in less time. And so it's profit motive that's doing this. Now, if that continues, depends on whether people continue paying and what the yield is like and how much they get per victim and how many victims they get for a unit of time. And so this comes down to pure finances. You can also apply game theory to
Yeah, and I was reading a little bit
it.
about Lockbit and how
Hmm.
fast and efficient that piece of software is, ransomware as a service, whatever the
Highly
code
automated.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's automated. It could go through and encrypt a certain number of files within a certain amount of time, and it's really fast. But I know you're not talking encryption here, but you're talking exfiltration. So it's
Hmm.
copying those files, right? I think I read about 22 databases being copied. So they got access to the OS, and they used some tools, OS tools, to make copies of the database and all the data within them
There's
to
some smart storage people there.
yeah, so
Smart backup and
and
storage. Like, if
they
only they
took
did
that
real jobs. Yeah.
right. They took that information and said, "Okay, we have exfiltrated your data. We have copies of everything. We are going to expose that information if you don't pay us
Hmm.
whatever Bitcoin or whatever, you know, cryptocurrency that they want." And then that's when it all hits the fan. Like, what's the actual process like if
Well,
filtration happens? And they're saying they're not encrypting your data, but I mean, I'm sure that there's some type of plan that you have to something that you have to do to alert internal the board or CEO and start that process.
so there's a lot of processes here. Let's talk about the processes for the bad guys. Well, first of all, they have a supply chain. They begin to look like us. In other words, they have people that do the logistics part and the compromise part, and then they actually sell leads, and they have good customer service. They have people that work on the cash out. And I mention that because that actually, you have to be careful. If you pay, the supply chain that sold your compromise may sell it again to another gang. And then there's the defenders processes. So you can actually prepare it when the automation is there, because deception works very well, especially against automation. In preparation before an event, you should be doing a few things. You should be limiting the blast radius. In other words, if something happens, how far can they get? And you
Hmm.
should be reducing the chance of an incident. And deception, of course, if you can deploy it, works very well, but it works especially well against automated processes,
Hmm.
because once they start trying to find those disks in order to do backup, you want to slow down the rate at which they're hitting real disks. And so that will send you alerts to your incident response, your security teams. You want to
Right.
contain it to smaller areas and have them scanning through useless, non-existent disks and wasting their time while you respond. So
Okay.
so that's beforehand. Now
So
let's
like a
get to the
lure.
lures and baits, but
Yeah.
not just to tie up in the classic sense of a human with a a honey pot or a tar pit, but like a tar pit in this instance, explicitly meaning it catches them and holds them down, wasting cycles, even
Hmm.
machine cycles, buying time in defense to get that signal and start to do things. But so one of the best strategies there is a zero trust strategy, because what you're doing is saying remove options for them
Hmm.
and limit the ability to go laterally if they actually get a purchase somewhere.
Okay.
So by that I mean, reduce the access that's available, and then provide, I used to call it negative trust,
Mm-hmm.
provide targets that are really a waste of time, so that they have to slow down and do more validation, and every move could set off a tripwire. So now let's talk
Right.
about the human side. Ahead of time, you should be preparing and coordinating and tabletopping, but tabletopping isn't just a dry exercise done in a few hours. You should also be practicing things like your backup, your recovery,
Yeah.
but it involves legal, and it involves HR, it involves marketing, right? And it involves, I mean that. The comms people have to be involved. What do you say? Who determines materiality? When do you get attorney-client privilege? When do you make a decision to pay, including the finance department? And so on. These are not trivial questions.
And
And
you're
then
not recommending paying the ransom,
I,
right?
I
You're
actually
talking maybe
don't.
cyber insurance.
Oh, no, I'm very hesitant to ever say just don't. Because what if you're a hospital? Or what if you're in the energy sector and really bad things could happen? Like really is a
Yeah.
risk trade-off, but I would
Right.
encourage people to try to not ever do so if they can get away. And you obviously can't in some cases, like when you're funding international crime, and if you're funding pariah nations or cyber terrorists or terrorist organizations, you can't. You just like, so you need legal involved to know. That would be a big no-no. You need to work with the government in those instances as well. Like that you must. So now we get to the processes and recovery processes as well. This is all about preparedness, so you know what to
Mm-hmm.
do in the moment, and practicing, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of organizations haven't thought about it that way. So, and I say that because I know that I've seen people who they go to their boards, they go to their C levels, and they say, "This is the plan." And everyone goes, "Yeah, that looks like the plan." And they go, "Well, here we've done some practices and so on." And yet, when the real incident comes, the cyber folks are surprised to find that people suddenly care,
Mm.
and that they're not the ones necessarily in charge. Suddenly the CEO is involved, and there's a board person present, and there's a marketing person who's saying what the message should be, and there's
Mm-hmm.
lawyers trying to figure out what's going on. And they realize, I couldn't get them to attend the tabletop before, and now they're all present. Well, of course they're all present, because now it's real. And that's where
Yeah.
the alignment between cyber and the business was needed before, and you really realize it was lacking. And it's not, you can't say it's anyone's fault. It's a different world the day of and after, from then on, an incident.
Yeah. So how do you get someone to actually take a tabletop exercise, like take it for real? And
Mhm.
in my mind, it has to be from the top down. So the board and CEO has to mandate it and, say, hey, we have to take this serious. Here's the date and time that we're going to walk through our cyber recovery plan, or whatever the plan may be. All teams need to be involved. There's no excuses, etc. So that's how I look at it. Is that
You've got to invest in it. You got to
right?
invest in it, and my advice is don't do it at a table necessarily.
Okay.
And obviously you tabletop them, but once, when you really first do this, I learned this lesson during COVID. We had to do a tabletop, and my organization, we decided to do it remote anyway. So we decided to go to Overboard. I had a pen test team. I had some former consultants. So we stood up a separate instance of Slack that looked just like Slack for our company. We had Zoom ready to go. We had the admins involved, and we got a precious 3 hours with, I guess, nearly 30 people involved, but we warned people they might be pulled into it. So it was an
Hmm.
expanding exercise. And our legal counsel at the time said, "No, this is a waste of time. This is whatever."
Yeah.
And we simulated a real thing we were worried about. We were worried about an IPO where somebody was basically, there was possibility of lost source code, and that
Hmm.
this would go to the press. And later in the debrief, when we did the hot wash, our legal counsel said, I was like, this is a waste of my time. And 10 minutes in, my brain shifted and said, this is real.
Mm.
And so you got to get them in that mode where your brain can't tell the difference between practice and reality, because that's where you're going to get the amygdala response, the fight or flight response. And the tools, I think in essence, because we did this online, the tools were exactly what the person would have been faced with if they were working from home, and they were in a different Slack space, and
Yeah.
we had Zoom instances going,
Yep.
and so suddenly they were having real meetings. They were
Hmm.
calling them on the spot. They were trying to figure out what to say. We even had external counsel ready in part of the exercise. So it was one of the biggest exercises I ever did. The next time we did it at a table, everyone turned up serious. But that first one,
Yeah.
I put a lot of resources into it of my own that I had, and it just so happens that some of them had been consultants and some of them were pen testers or red
Yeah.
teamers, and it involved technical people and business people. But I think you've really got to put that effort in and talk to your peers. So if you're thinking about doing this, go talk to colleagues in other companies and best practices. We can help each other do this. In fact, I even had a CISO friend of mine who came in as an external, advisor to advise the company.
Yeah. And how often should you be performing these tests? And I know this may be a vague question because it
Oh, it's hard.
may depend on the organization and the resources, and how often they should do it is around what's critical and what's not critical.
Yeah, so it's really hard to tell how often you should be doing tabletops because too often and it ceases to have meaning. In my experience, it's usually once every 2 to 3 quarters. If you're doing it more frequently than that, you're probably wasting people's time or distracting from business. If you do it less than once a year, then I would go 3 quarters ish. Less than once a year, and it's not fresh enough, right? And you've also got to consider that the risk landscape could change quite dramatically. Think about what it was like in 2022. The thought of AI probably didn't enter anyone's minds, but now you might be tabletopping with deep fakes. And by the way, you can game those cheaply, right?
Yeah, that is crazy. Wow.
Mm,
And yeah, I know we've talked about a few things, and maybe one more question here before we begin
mhm,
to wrap up. Where do you see, you've mentioned AI,
mm.
and
As
obviously
everyone
we
does, as
know that,
everyone does. Yeah.
yes, where do you think we're headed with the war between good versus bad as it
Mm.
pertains to leveraging artificial intelligence and protecting the world's data, and people protecting their data within their organizations?
Well, I think that no technology is inherently good or evil when it's made. I think it's obviously the applications to which we put it. But if we just keep piling on technology on top of the stacks we already have, then we're actually going to get worse at defense. It's not just that the bad guys are getting better at their profession and their craft faster than us in the good guys in defense, but we've actually got to rethink our architectures. And that's the challenge.
Hmm.
I look at I once asked a CFO friend of mine, you know, what does each department want? And he went through and said, development wants engineers and marketing wants program dollars. And I said, what does security want? And he said, I don't want to tell you. I said, no, really, tell me. He said, well, you guys want toys and you never give your toys back.
Right.
Meaning you're just buying stuff and you've got stuff that's been down in that basement in the racks for 30 years. At some point, when do you throw it out and get more efficient? When do you transform? Why do you exist? What's a pound of security mean? And that's an excellent question because if we're not revisiting and thinking of ourselves as a responsible entity within the company, moving dollars from capex to opex, getting more agile in how we deploy capital to do the security thing,
Hmm.
then he's right. We're wasting dollars and we're not using the money correctly, and we've got old toys gathering dust. And so I say that because we need to rethink our architectures. We actually have to transform the way we do security.
Okay.
And it's incumbent upon IT to do it. It's incumbent upon app dev to do it. We had the DevOps revolution and Agile,
Hmm.
and IT now needs to rethink itself, and so does security. All of three of us together need to rethink how we as a service help the business achieve its ends for less cost, more efficiency, better user experience, and less risk. And one of those things is I mentioned zero trust earlier, but zero trust is a result, right? So how do we go about building networks where we don't have to trust the underlying carrier infrastructure, that have more reliability for connectivity, and that we move up in the stack so that we do authorization correctly, and only what needs to be connected is what's connected, and
Right.
only for as long as the business needs it. And when you start thinking that that is the challenge, you start going, oh, okay, well, a lot of the stuff I have right now is actually getting in the way, and I need to rethink my stack and what are the services that I deliver. And I think if we do that, we can change the outcome. But if we just keep piling more onto this pile of toys, not only are we not, playing anymore, it's kind of bad hoarder behavior and it's not business responsible.
Yeah. So having on-prem infrastructure in the cloud, and also having just multiple locations where you have data scatter. You have SaaS applications. I mean, you have data everywhere. But identity, I heard, is the new attack vector, right? So
It's a new
across,
control plane. It's a new attack
right.
vector. But we used to have this crunchy perimeter where we did nothing but authentication, and then everyone was in. But it's this notion of fine-grained authorization scale.
Mm-hmm.
What should you do under what conditions, and to what degree do you have access, as opposed to just yes, no.
Right.
That's a more interesting world to be in, right? How do you touch something, and when, and what sorts of permissions do you have based on the conditions and context of your access? That's a more interesting world than just, hey, you jump over the enormous authentication hurdle and now welcome inside the castle.
Yeah. Well, awesome, Sam. I do appreciate the time that you have spent educating us around encryptionless protection, and also a little bit about AI and just overall. And also, I do want to let everyone know about the Backup and Recovery Professionals LinkedIn group. There's almost 26,000 people now in that group on LinkedIn. So be sure to check that group out as well. And Sam, any final shout out that you would like to leave?
I just want to end on a positive note. I think a lot of attention is being paid to what the bad guys will do and the negativity around AI. But the funny thing is, as we start to build new technologies in general into the stack, it often doesn't get lionized because it just becomes a productive part of the machinery. And so I think if we get the architecture right and we start to actually innovate and figure out ways of making this part of the productive machinery, then there's an upside. Things can get really, really good if we can foil and frustrate these people who are exploiting our systems and attacking hospitals, attacking critical infrastructure. We can make a more resilient world, I think, and that's exciting.
Yeah, and especially if we all begin to work together as a team and share our knowledge, share our resources, and keep just doing things like this and kind of working together the same way they are. So thanks again, my friend, for being a guest here on the podcast. And as usual, I'm sure we'll be tapping in with you again in the future.
Thank you for having me. It's been great, and I always enjoy our talks.